Faith isn't something that you can see, but it's one of the most powerful forces in the world. One of the greatest chapters on faith in all of the Bible is Hebrews chapter 11. There, the author of the Hebrews describes the mighty acts of faith accomplished by Old Testament patriarchs and saints. The author to the Hebrews concludes that chapter by saying, "And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth." In other words, it was the life of faith that empowered these men and women to follow God, even in the midst of intense persecution. But just how much faith do you need to be mightily used by God? In this video, I want to talk about what it means to have faith the size of a mustard seed. So this language actually comes from the Gospels, in particular places like Matthew chapter 17, verses 14 through 20. Here's what it says. "And when they came to the crowd, a man came up to him and kneeling before him said, 'Lord, have mercy on my son, for he has seizures and he suffers terribly. For often he falls into the fire and often into the water. And I brought him to your disciples, and they could not heal him.' And Jesus answered, 'O faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him here to me.' And Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him, and the boy was healed instantly. Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, 'Why could we not cast it out?' And he said to them, 'Because of your little faith. For truly I say to you, if you have faith like a grain of mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you." Now, since Jesus says here that the disciples didn't have enough faith, I think it's important to address a common misconception, even an abuse of these words. There are people who think the reason God has not healed me or done such and such a thing in my life is because I just don't have enough faith. If only I had more faith, well then I'd have a better job or I wouldn't have cancer. That's an abuse of this text. The issue here really is unbelief, faithlessness. These disciples see this need in front of them, and yet they doubt the power and strength of the Lord. "O you of little faith," Jesus said to Peter on another occasion. And so it's really important that we recognize that there are times where we suffer, we experience hardship, not because of our unbelief or because of our little faith, but simply because in God's providence, that's where he has us. Now, what do you do to increase your faith? For one, you can pray just like the disciples did, but I also think of what the Apostle Paul said in Romans chapter 10. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. The word of God has the ability to create and nourish our faith, so that if we're struggling with faith, one thing that God calls us to do is to go to his word, to meditate upon it, to think about it. We often find that as we do, our faith grows. You also see this language in Luke chapter 17, verse 6, where instead of moving mountains, Jesus talked about moving mulberry trees. It's interesting because in that passage, the disciples asked Jesus to increase their faith. Verse 5 says, "The apostles said to the Lord, 'Increase our faith.' And the Lord said, 'If you had faith like a grain of a mustard seed, you could say to this mulberry tree, 'Be uprooted and planted in the sea,' and it would obey you.'" Now, the point that Jesus is making here is that you actually don't need a lot of faith to be effective in God's kingdom. Even mustard seed-sized faith can accomplish great things. Now, just how big are mustard seeds? Well, if you like to put whole grain mustard on your sandwich, you've seen those little bottles with partially ground mustard. You know that they're tiny, about 1 to 2 millimeters in size. In fact, elsewhere, when talking about the kingdom of God, Jesus said that the kingdom is like a mustard seed that grows into an enormous tree. Mark chapter 4, verses 31 and 32. Jesus said, the kingdom of God is like a grain of mustard seed, which when sown on the ground is the smallest of all the seeds on earth. And yet when it is sown, it grows up and becomes larger than all the garden plants and puts out large branches so that the birds of the air can make nests in its shade. Now here Jesus is using a little bit of hyperbole with regard at least to the size of the mustard seed. But his point is clear. Mustard seeds are small, but even very small things can have an enormous impact. And when the disciples came to Jesus wondering why they couldn't cast this demon out of the suffering child, Jesus said it was because they were faithless. This is interesting because typically we think that miracles or miraculous feats require mountain-sized faith, but Jesus seems to be saying the opposite here. He says even a little bit of faith can accomplish the impossible, and here's why. The strength and size of your faith is not what matters, but the object of your faith. And as Christians, the object of our faith is Jesus himself, the one for whom nothing is impossible. It might also be helpful to distinguish here between faith generally speaking and what the Bible sometimes calls the gift of faith. All Christians have faith, and that ability to believe in God is a gift that's given to us from God himself. Paul said in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God." Similarly, Peter said in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 1, "To those who have obtained a faith of equal standing with ours by the righteousness of our God and Savior, Jesus Christ." And that word obtained means to receive something by lot or to be appointed something. In other words, God has appointed to every believer the gift of faith. And yet sometimes God gives us a supernatural increase in faith to believe him for mountain moving, we might say. This might look like confidence when praying to God for the salvation of a lost family member or God's abundant provision in a time of scarcity. It's this gift of faith that Paul references in places like 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 2, saying, "And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and I have all faith, so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing." This concept of different measures of faith corresponding to gifts from God is also something we see in Romans chapter 12, verse 3 says, "For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. For as in one body we have many members, and the members do not all have the same function, so we, though many, are one body in Christ, and individually members of one another. Having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, let us use them. If prophecy, in proportion to our faith. If service, in our serving. The one who teaches in his teaching. The one who exhorts in his exhortation. The one who contributes in generosity. The one who leads with zeal. The one who does acts of mercy with cheerfulness." So every believer in Jesus has faith, and sometimes God increases our faith at a particular moment in time or during particular seasons for his service and glory. It's appropriate to join the apostles in asking Jesus to increase our faith. That's a valid prayer. God, I believe, but help my unbelief. Increase my faith. And when we're discouraged because we feel like our faith isn't very strong, it's important to remember that more important than having a ton of faith is where our faith is directed. You know, there are many people in the world who have great faith in the wrong things. Jesus can move mountains with a mustard seed amount of faith, but the faithless often find that he's not busy in their lives. This was the case with the people in his own hometown, in the town of Nazareth, where it was said, "He did not do many mighty works there because of their unbelief." Matthew chapter 13, verse 58. Unbelief leads to emptiness, but a small faith, even a weak faith, can lead to fruitfulness. I love the way the 17th century preacher Thomas Watson puts it. In response to the person who says, "But I fear I have no faith, it is so weak," he gives these comforting words. "If you have faith, though but in its infancy, be not discouraged, for a little faith is faith, as a spark of fire is fire. A weak faith may lay hold on a strong Christ. The promises are not made to strong faith, but to true. The promise does not say he who has a giant faith, who can believe God's love through a frown, who can rejoice in affliction, who can work wonders, remove mountains, stop the mouth of lions, shall be saved. But whoever believes, be his faith never so small. Therefore, Christian, be not discouraged. God, who would have us receive them that are weak in faith, will not himself refuse them. Are you weak in faith right now? Pray to Jesus to increase your faith, and take comfort in the fact that even your small faith can lay hold of Jesus, and through Jesus accomplish great things.